Greetings, friends, family, and survivors. Well, Mr. Gibbs and I are about 1.5 miles out our back door, and it was interesting getting up in here because of the water. And I think we crossed the creek 4 or 5 times and went across a pasture that the whole thing's 4 inches underwater, but my quad's light enough to get on top of it without falling through, which was nice. A truck could never make it, and you'd sink it to the belly pan. But quad's able to sneak up in here, and I'm up looking for sign, and I found 2 more gut piles, muley deers from the coyotes, and a wolf. It's so nice being able to hear water running down. The water has been running in that creek for about a month. Of course, a month ago this was a couple feet of snow right here, but there's still a lot of snow melt up on top. In fact, that's why the Sprague River has been at flood stage, been a flood warning for a couple of weeks now. So it is brimming for sure. Should be for a while as the snow up on top continues to melt. But I can see here, this draw here I couldn't get to a month ago. I tried and it was just too deep. And so done a lot of melting over the last month, and that's a good thing. You can see all this is reprod right there. Just jumping out of the ground. You want to go? All right, next stop. Piles there, pile of bones. Gibbs wants a drink. Want water? Here we go. You want water, Mr. Gibbs? Gibbs, come. You drink. I know you're thirsty. Oh well. He was chasing the ball before we got on the quad, and he was pretty thirsty then. He's excited, that's for sure. He's seen me wander off on my quad without him at least the last 10 times. Today he gets to come. So that bowl down here where that meadow is has 4 or 5 of these little tributaries going into it. And then it goes out behind my house and then runs down through a little lake about a 1/4 mile from my house. That lake's full, so that's very cool. You want to go? Kind of thought he did. Tired puppy. Down here through some aspen. Careful where I drive, or I'll be walking home. Isn't that beautiful? Spring popping up right there. I know right where my house is, it looks dry and desert-like, and that's because of a couple of fires that went through. One 12 years ago and the other one in 2015. 2015 one burnt about 12, 15 homes, something like that. Sorry about the wind. But this is just literally, as a crow flies, this is 1.5 miles. It's actually 2 miles by trail, but it's 1.5 miles from the house. So right out my back door is National Forest. And from here it gets greener and bigger timber as you go up the mountain. And so I thought I'd stop for a cup of joe. Haven't done that in a few years. I've been hopping on my motorcycle or my quad and going out and making a cup of coffee in the woods. And just sitting, thinking, praying. See, I knew he was thirsty. So I've been doing that since the early 70s. And I've lived in the Pacific Northwest in the mountains since 71, I believe. And I've been a mountain boy ever since. And it's something I kind of take for granted. I've just never been much for town. I like this spot because it reminds me of our other homestead. You've seen the lower pasture there with the big bass pond and the creek running into it. Just quiet. So by the grace of God, I've been able to live in places like that since the 70s. Get behind this tree. Cup of joe, my dog. Presence of the Lord. And I've been a lot more at peace living in rural places, and at times extremely rural places. There was some trade-offs, but they were all, every place you go has a caveat, right? But the trade-offs for me were good. When you live in a rural area, the wages can be a lot less. And when I was building custom homes in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Dad and I were building custom homes. And we also were doing millwright work, building plants and stuff, factories. The money was really good, and I lived in the mountains, remote, but we were on the road driving a lot, and that gets old too, right? And so it was in 1989 when the big earthquake hit, 7.1 earthquake, and I was millwrighting. I'm sorry, I'm talking slow, I'm tired, catching my breath here. I was millwrighting in Washington, 36 an hour in 1989. And let's see, they paid me $12 an hour at night to sleep, per diem, fuel, food, motel, all that was covered. So really good money. But you're on the road. And so that just didn't seem like that was the best way to raise a family. So I went to work in a local mill, and I worked there while my kids were growing up. And I went from 36 an hour to $14 an hour, and was able to build a home on $14 an hour. A big home, 1,600 square foot home. So the trade-off was, yeah, I was making less money, but I was home every night with the family. And the kids didn't need me to have lots of money. You know, they didn't need a new car for graduation and me to have a college fund for them. And that's kind of hard with 6 kids, no matter how much money you make, right? What they needed was me, quality time. They needed me. They needed me home. And I was home every night. So money's not all it's cracked up to be. So living in a rural area is much, much better for families. And yes, you drive an older car and you have less of a house on the wages you find in a rural area. But you'll find those smaller schools and those smaller communities are much more conducive to raising families. Now, some people are called to city life and they do well and they thrive there, but that's definitely not me. So over the years, it's been easier for me to relate to country folk for that reason. And when you live in an area where hunting and fishing, growing and your own food and canning, chickens, livestock, you start to be able to relate to the simpler things of life, and you have more appreciation for simple things. Now, if I was in town, boy, it'd just be like, what would you do? All you could do is stare at a video screen and of places that are beautiful like this and see it on TV rather than go stand in the middle of it. And I just don't think I could abide by that. So God equips each of us differently, and I'm a mountain boy at heart. I grew up backpacking in the high Sierras with my parents, and my grandma actually was a backpacker. My grandma, I think she was born in 1916, Estes Park, Colorado. She's gone on to be with the Lord now, but Grandma's been to the top of Mount Whitney twice. My mom's been to the top of Mount Whitney twice. It's over 14,000 feet and quite a hike. So I come from a backpacking family, wilderness outings. And so that's in my blood. Being in the mountains is in my blood. And so we've been burning wood only for heat since 70 or 71, something like that. It's just kind of a way of life. And I think it's a healthy way of life. In my opinion, mankind doesn't behave well when they're all bunched up. And I have friends that live in cities that are thriving there. God's called them there and they're doing fine. But I also notice that they take a lot of vacations up into the mountains. I totally get that. Now, if God calls me to inner city ministry, I'm going. I hope he doesn't. But if he wants me to go, I will go. I'd sure rather be here. And this place has its challenges, no doubt. And I'm with people all the time. You can't minister to a pine tree. It's kind of hard to lead a pine tree to Jesus. You give an altar call to come to the Lord and they just kind of stand there. So I don't think we were really called to be hermits, right? But it makes the relationships that you do have more meaningful. And so I read a study about rats. You know how they use rats for scientific studies? I was reading this study where they were putting rats in a cage, big cage, and feeding it, and they had things to play and to do, and there was a social structure, and they started recording the changes, psychological changes, the cultural changes that were happening within the rats community as they added each additional rat. And they found that when they had a certain number of rats in a certain number of square feet, and I don't remember the details, but this detail I do remember, when it got to a certain point, the rats stopped communicating with each other. They didn't talk to each other. They would just huddle in a corner and face away from everybody. And so that's kind of how I see cities when I go down to California, visit family or whatever. Carol told me, you've got to stop talking to people. And I would say, well, why? I'm just being friendly. They go, no, they think you want something from them. And so I looked and I noticed that people, strangers on the street, don't talk to each other. They just ignore each other. Thousands of people milling everywhere, and nobody's smiling or talking at all. Standing in the grocery lines, nobody's talking. What in the world? And that made me think about that study with the rats. I think it's a good thing to be able to go off by yourself and spend some time talking to the Lord. And that's hard to do when the phone's ringing, the TV's on, the radio's blaring, the horn's honking, the neighbors next door are fighting. So whatever you have to do to get alone so that you can hear God. Now let me be very clear. There are people that say to me, well, my church is in the woods. Sorry, that's not true. Because the word church in the Greek, the original language of the New Testament, the word ecclesia means the called out assembly. Called out of the world, but there's an assembly. There's got to be a gathering together of believers. So no, you're not having church in the woods by yourself. You may be communing with the Lord, and you should. And your prayer life can be enhanced spending quiet time with the Lord in the wilderness. I highly recommend it. But no, that's not church. Church is an assembly of believers. Big difference. So don't know why I'm sharing all of that. I've probably shared it in the past. I'll probably share it in the future. But gosh, it's peaceful out here. And Mr. Gibbs sure needed an outing. All right, if I find something else interesting, I'll sure let you know. Have a very blessed night.